Hello, my name's Jason, and the whole premise of my A3d project was to create an entirely new vehicle concept based on the Mad Max art styling. Everything in the Mad Max universe has a very distinctive, crazed mechanical feel to it, usually consisting of a broken down, torn apart car, repaired in weird and hazardous ways, usually with scrap metal welding for DIY defense and a multitude of weapons. This gave me a great starting point as I could look at a wide range of pre-existing apocalyptic vehicles and take any feature that I liked. Starting with a Dodge 1970s Challenger body, I attempted to convert it into a bunker, taking the wasteland environment into consideration with a giant front plough to ram vehicles and block projectiles, a full armoured shell for the vehicle's cannon, half tracks to give the vehicle a lot more traction, and heavily armoured panels across the entire body. I received feedback on the design from week 2 onwards until I managed to get it looking at least functional. At this stage, I was already quite confident when it came to the modelling side. I used the project to focus very heavily on the PBR principles and learning how to create effective PBR textures within the new software suites, such as Substance Designer. To take it a step further, as I had a fair bit of time remaining after the modelling phase, I also used it as an excuse to develop an entirely new workflow, as texturing was by far my weakest point and needed a lot of improvement. Covering it briefly, it took a lot of trial and error. I first attempted to texture the vehicle based off base colours, before adding noise, but this just didn't give me the detail I required, and I couldn't personally see how I'd complete the task at hand. This did give me a good indication of component colouring, which was incredibly useful for future reference. From this, I transitioned to Substance Designer, importing my vehicle with material groups and began attempting to create textures. I had used this software briefly over the summer period, but still had to spend a lot of time learning the tools and how to achieve very specific effects. It was fantastic practice when it came to the PBR, as every stage of the texturing development cycle was broken down to individual icons and nodes so you could clearly see the effects of each little change within the view box, and learn from every last mistake. As I struggled prior with the understanding of the principles of PBR, using this software suite alone was a huge leap in knowledge. It wasn't possible to complete the entire texturing process in Designer, although I was able to create a master node graph that could be used to generate most of the base textures while also leaving them entirely seamless. This last point was probably the biggest breakthrough. By putting these base textures in Photoshop and attaching black masks to each one, I could use a colour ID map to locate components before simply painting them white for the material and black to remove them. This made the document non-destructive and to an extent reusable for other assets. Any final touches such as rust detailing and sand details could be painted straight onto the mesh in Substance Painter, after importing my prior Substance Designer materials. Overall, this new workflow and software suite has helped me develop my PBR skill set dramatically, provided a lot of insight into what could be achieved with node-based PBR texturing, and its time advantages once a master graph has been set up to be reused for multiple assets. As with all software suites, this may be quite time-consuming your first attempt, but once you get used to the workflow and follow one of the many tutorials on the Algorithmic Forum or YouTube page, you can take a 4 or 5 hour texturing task and cram it down into maybe 20 minutes if you have the node graph set up correctly, just by changing simple parameters. When it came to the alpha presentation feedback, I was told by both lecturers and peers that it looked far too toy-like to fit in with a Mad Maxy style, and the background seemed far too barren at that. Firstly, addressing the vehicle look, I found the Substance Designer processed metalness maps differently to Unreal Engine 4, and in the process I had accidentally made these maps grayscale instead of white and black as they displayed perfectly fine in Substance Suite software. In contrast, my roughness maps were made far darker to compensate. Thankfully, because of my non-destructive texturing workflow, what I've just developed, I could simply go back to each main material within my texture file and adjust the light and darkness masks to fix this, although it's very hard to see the difference with the reflections of the sand dune. But either way, it's good practice getting this right as a standard. In regards to the background, after a lot of trial and error, I managed to make a sandstorm effect by creating what was practically light fog before heavily adapting the emitter settings to dramatically increase the size of each particle and its direction. It would have been a much smarter move, planning this out right at the start and making this blueprint as I was doing the original modelling stages, as due to there being zero documentation, it was complete utter luck if it got completed in time. Thankfully, I could use my initiative and look at example blueprints to try and get the rough values right, but thankfully after about 7 or 8 hours of trial and error it got accomplished, although it should not have been left as late as it had been. It wouldn't have been entirely end of the world though, as I would have still had 2 to 3 weeks to create some basic scenery, although just as the sandstorm is, or how it is displaying currently, it really adds a lot of motion to the scene and quite literally it makes the desert landscape. To then identify the ground below the sandstorm to take this a step further, I duplicated it, changed it to a much darker brown and simply lowered it so it would only appear close to the sand dunes themselves and the landscape. The last key issue with the sandstorm was its opacity. You could barely see the seam once it generated past your camera location, but this was fixed by creating an opacity over distance node graph, simply recreating and reconfiguring an optimization graph, so instead of switching between texture resolutions over distance, I could plug the same graph into the opacity input and use a lerp to switch the opacity values from 0 to 1 and any gradient between, the closer or further away the camera got. I could then change just two values to have full control over the sandstorm visibility distance, opening up a lot more useful things I could then do in the future for the matinee. I did originally want to add a lot more assets to the scene to bring it more to life, but feel that the sandstorm combined with just the basic assets to define a highway were really all that it needed. To make it a bit more unique, I added the name of the vehicle to the highway sign and created a very simple flaming barrel asset, although this, alongside the rest of the environmental assets, were textured with very little effort just by changing my Substance Designer master graph. Of course I still had to make entirely new textures for the sand and the gravel, but once again I could just reuse old graphs that had the rough boundaries I wanted and just change parameters to get the desired result. This is one of my favourite things about PBR texturing in Substance Designer, especially with every single texture you make in Designer tiling by default, unless you change it otherwise, entirely removing the need to find either a pre-tiling texture on the internet or tiling it manually in Photoshop that can be very time consuming. Originally I wanted to have assets moving around the sandstorm and have these trigger body deformation of the vehicle, but when speaking to Danny Bannister at week 4, I found that my vehicle had to be a single joined mesh, which would have led me to have to re-UV and remodel huge areas of the vehicle, using a lot of time that I could not waste at this stage. On top of this, I wanted the vehicle to physically drive, but as I placed all the vehicle UVs on a single texture sheet, it was impossible to have an animated track texture without applying a brand new texture sheet. Sure, this could have been possible, but would have left a huge gap in my UV sheet and made the entire thing just look far too messy and unprofessional. For these reasons, I kept it out. On the upside, to make up for these detractions, I put a lot more time and effort into the PBR elements and developing the new workflow, so in a sense, the project evolved from an animation and blueprint focused project to a PBR technique evaluation. When it came to the time management, I had finished concepting and planning by the end of week 1, finalised the high poly model using smooth preview and an absorbent amount of edge loops by the end of week 2, had the low poly model done by mid-week 3, as a high poly was structured with most of the low poly geometry before smoothing, so all that I really needed to do was take off any unneeded edge loops and just the overall topology and optimise it. By the end of week 3, the low poly was UV'd with May 2016 bonus tools, as the new UVing tool seemed to be far too glitchy to use effectively, and upwards until week 10 was spent learning new software suites and developing the new workflow. The scene assets were created and textured, bar the flaming barrel, just before alpha, and the finalised touches that were originally planned for week 7 onwards included the sandstorm, texturing feedback changes, flaming barrel, and altering the matinee cameras to make it smoother came under the final few weeks, including transitions. Not exactly how I planned it out, but I was still left with plenty of time remaining to add in special areas such as the sandstorm slowly rolling in as the matinee continues on. This was accomplished by rendering out the matinee sequence 4 times, changing the player's view distance slightly for each one, really adding a lot of life into the final render, leaving me with a very nice sunset overwhelming sand effect to the end. Overall, I believe this project was a huge success, entirely based on the PBR texturing knowledge it provided me, and the portfolio piece I can now use as a leading factor in my showreel. Within future projects, I would still need to incorporate areas such as Quixel and ZBrush, just so I have the added software knowledge, and due to all my work on hard surface modelling, I need to move towards something more organic, something that my scene was severely missing, which overall made it look a bit too structured and unnatural. Thankfully, the sandstorm almost entirely nullified this, so thank you for listening to my A3d presentation, and goodbye.